In 1840, in the remote village of Stillwater Hollow, nestled deep in the Appalachian mountains, there existed a schoolhouse that served as the heart of the community. But within its wooden walls hung something that no one dared to remove, something that had been there for decades before the village even had a name. A wedding dress, small, impossibly small. The dress of a child. And everyone who came to Stillwater Hollow learned the same rule on their first day. Never touch the dress, never speak of it after sunset, and never, ever ask why it's there. Because the last person who asked never stopped screaming. This is the story of how that dress came to hang in the schoolhouse, and why some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The dress was the first thing Margaret Ashford noticed when she arrived at the Stillwater Hollow schoolhouse on a frost-bitter morning in October 1840. She had travelled 3 days by wagon from Charleston, her belongings reduced to a single trunk and a leather satchel containing her teaching credentials. At 23, Margaret was considered old for an unmarried woman, but her education made her valuable in these remote mountain communities where school teachers were scarce and desperately needed. The village council had hired her sight unseen, based solely on a letter of recommendation from the Charleston Female Academy. What they hadn't told her in their correspondence was that the previous 4 teachers had all left within months, and the one before them had simply vanished one November night, leaving behind only a journal filled with increasingly frantic entries that no one in the village would discuss. The schoolhouse stood at the edge of the village, a simple structure of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney that leaked smoke even when no fire burned inside. Margaret pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges screaming in protest, and stepped into the dim interior. Rows of crude benches faced a simple desk at the front of the room. A slate board hung on the wall, and there, suspended from the ceiling beam by a length of faded ribbon, was the wedding dress. It hung perfectly still in the musty air, untouched by the draught that had followed Margaret inside. The dress was exquisite despite its age, made of ivory silk that had yellowed to the color of old bones. Lace adorned the collar and cuffs, intricate lacework that must have taken months to complete. But it was the size that made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. This was a dress for a child, a very young child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old at most. Margaret set down her satchel and approached the dress slowly, as if it might startle and fly away like some strange bird. Up close, she could see that the silk had been preserved with remarkable care. There were no moth holes, no signs of decay, despite what must have been years, perhaps decades, hanging in this drafty schoolhouse. The lace was pristine, and there, just visible on the inside of the collar, was a name embroidered in thread, so fine it was almost invisible. Eliza Wren, May 1819, 21 years ago. Margaret reached out to touch the fabric, her fingers inches from the silk. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, miss." The voice came from behind her, sharp and urgent. Margaret spun around to find a girl of about 16 standing in the doorway. She had dark hair, pulled severely back from a pale, angular face, and eyes that seemed too old for her years. She wore a simple homespun dress and carried a bucket of water in one hand. "I'm Sarah Brennan," the girl said, setting down the bucket. "The minister's daughter. I help clean the schoolhouse, or I try to. Some things here don't like being cleaned." She looked pointedly at the wedding dress. Margaret felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment at being caught reaching for the dress like a curious child. "I'm Margaret Ashford, the new teacher. I was just wondering about this dress. It seems an odd decoration for a schoolhouse." Sarah's expression didn't change. "It's not a decoration, miss. It's a keeping. The dress has hung there since before my mother was born, and she's 43 now. No one moves it. No one touches it. That's the first rule of teaching here." Margaret laughed, trying to lighten the oppressive atmosphere of the room. "Surely that's just superstition." "It's only a dress." Sarah didn't smile. "The last teacher said the same thing. Mr. Holloway. He'd been here 2 months and decided the dress was unhygienic, breeding disease in the air. He took it down one afternoon in September. We found him the next morning sitting at his desk, stone dead with his eyes open. He was 31 years old and healthy as an ox. The doctor said it was heart failure, but Mr. Holloway's heart wasn't what failed him, miss. It was his judgment. The temperature in the schoolhouse seemed to drop several degrees. Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. That's a tragic story, but surely you don't believe the dress killed him. Sarah picked up a rag from the bucket and began wiping down the benches with methodical precision. I believe what I've seen, miss. And I've seen enough in my 16 years to know that some rules exist for good reasons, even if those reasons don't make sense to newcomers. The dress stays. That's all. Margaret wanted to press the issue, to demand a proper explanation, but something in Sarah's tone suggested that further questions would be unwelcome. Instead, she turned her attention to preparing the schoolhouse for the next day's lessons. She spent the rest of the morning arranging her few books on the desk, checking the supply of slates and chalk, and trying to ignore the wedding dress that hung in her peripheral vision like a ghost that refused to fade. By midday, several women from the village arrived with offerings of bread, preserves, and a basket of apples for the new teacher. They were polite but reserved, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Margaret noticed how carefully they avoided looking at the wedding dress, their gazes sliding past it as if it simply didn't exist. Only one woman, ancient and bent with age, stopped directly beneath the dress and looked up at it with an expression Margaret couldn't quite interpret. Longing? Fear? Regret? You feel it too, don't you? The old woman said quietly, her voice like dry leaves rustling. The cold spot beneath the dress. It's always been there, even in summer, even when the schoolhouse is hot as an oven, that spot stays cold. Cold as a grave in winter. Before Margaret could respond, one of the younger women hurried over and guided the old woman away, murmuring apologies. Don't mind old Betsy, she gets confused sometimes, mixes up her memories with her dreams. But Margaret had felt it. When she'd stood beneath the dress earlier, there had been a noticeable drop in temperature. A pocket of cold air that seemed to emanate from the garment itself. That evening, Margaret was given lodging in a small cottage behind the minister's house. It was clean and simply furnished, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair positioned before a small fireplace. Sarah brought her a tray of dinner, cold chicken, bread, and weak tea. As the girl set down the tray, Margaret decided to risk another question. Sarah, the name embroidered inside the dress collar, Eliza Wren. Was she from this village? Sarah's hands stilled on the tray. For a long moment she didn't respond. Then, without looking at Margaret, she said quietly, "There are no Wrens in Stillwater Hollow, miss. There never have been. That's the second strange thing about the dress. The first is that it exists at all. The third is what happens to people who try to take it down. But the fourth, well, that's what you'll discover if you stay long enough. Most teachers don't." With that cryptic statement, Sarah left. Pulling the door firmly shut behind her, Margaret ate her meager dinner and tried to read by candlelight, but her mind kept returning to the wedding dress. A child's wedding dress from 1819, embroidered with a name that belonged to no one in the village. A dress that had hung in the schoolhouse for decades, untouched and perfectly preserved. A dress that seemed to exist in its own pocket of cold air. It made no sense. None of it made sense. But Margaret was a rational woman, educated in the sciences and literature, and she refused to be frightened by village superstitions. Tomorrow she would teach her first lessons, and she would do so with the same professional competence she'd shown at the Charleston Female Academy. The dress was merely an oddity, a peculiar bit of local history, nothing more. She blew out the candle and settled into bed, pulling the thin quilts up to her chin. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the mountain passes like something alive and hungry. And in the darkness, Margaret could have sworn she heard the faint sound of a child singing, a voice so pure and clear it seemed to come from inside the cottage itself. But when she lit the candle again with trembling hands, she was completely alone. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with a mist so thick Margaret could barely see 10 feet in front of her. She dressed quickly, braided her dark hair into a severe knot at the nape of her neck, and made her way to the schoolhouse through the swirling fog. Inside, someone had already started a fire in the stove, and the room was almost warm. Almost. The cold spot beneath the wedding dress remained, a circle of winter air that defied the heat. Margaret's students arrived in small groups, children ranging in age from 6 to 14. Dressed in homespun clothes and worn boots. They filed in silently, taking their seats with a discipline that surprised Margaret. No chattering, no pushing or shoving. They simply sat and waited, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was unsettling. Margaret counted 17 students in total. 16 of them looked at her with varying degrees of curiosity or indifference. But the 17th, a small girl of about 7, with pale blonde hair and enormous blue eyes, stared not at Margaret, but at the wedding dress hanging above and behind the teacher's desk. The child's gaze never wavered, never blinked, and on her face was an expression of such profound sadness that Margaret felt her heart constrict. "Good morning, students," Margaret began, forcing confidence into her voice. "I am Miss Ashford, your new teacher. We shall begin each day with reading, followed by arithmetic, and then history or geography in the afternoon. I expect diligence, respect, and honesty from each of you." A boy of about 12 raised his hand. Margaret nodded at him. "Yes. Will you be staying, miss, or will you leave like the others?" The question hung in the air. Several children shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "I intend to stay as long as I am needed," Margaret replied firmly. "Now let us begin with reading. I want each of you to tell me your name and demonstrate your reading level. We'll start with the youngest. You there, in the front." She pointed to the small blonde girl who'd been staring at the dress. The child didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear. "Her name is Abigail Thorne," another girl volunteered. "She don't talk much, miss. Hasn't said more than a few words since her mother died last winter." Margaret softened her tone. "I'm sorry to hear that, Abigail. You don't have to read aloud today if you don't wish to. We'll wait until you're ready." For the first time, Abigail looked directly at Margaret, and what the teacher saw in those blue eyes made her blood run cold. There was knowledge there, terrible knowledge, that no 7-year-old child should possess. And beneath the knowledge, a warning. Abigail's lips moved, forming words without sound. Margaret found herself leaning forward, trying to read the child's lips. 3 words, repeated over and over. She's still waiting. Before Margaret could respond, Abigail turned her attention back to the wedding dress, resuming her unblinking vigil. The other students proceeded with their reading demonstrations, most managing simple passages with varying degrees of fluency. Margaret made notes, assessed their levels, and began planning lessons in her head. But throughout the morning, she found her gaze drawn repeatedly to Abigail Thorne and to the wedding dress that seemed to hold the child in some kind of spell. At the midday break, the children scattered outside to eat their lunches of bread and apples. Margaret remained in the schoolhouse, using the quiet time to organize her materials. She had deliberately avoided standing directly beneath the wedding dress all morning, but now, alone, she felt compelled to investigate the cold spot old Betsy had mentioned. Margaret positioned herself directly under the dress and looked up. From this angle, she could see details she'd missed before. The lacework wasn't just decorative. It formed patterns, symbols. Margaret recognized some of them from her studies of medieval history, protection symbols, warding signs. The kind of folk magic that had been common in Europe centuries ago, but had largely disappeared by the 19th century. Why would a child's wedding dress be covered in protection symbols? She reached up, not touching the dress, but holding her hand just beneath it. The cold was immediate and intense, as if she'd plunged her hand into icy water. But it wasn't just cold. There was a quality to the air here, a thickness, almost a resistance, as if the space beneath the dress existed in a slightly different reality than the rest of the room. Margaret pulled her hand back and stepped away quickly, her heart pounding. This was more than superstition. Something was genuinely wrong with this dress, with this space. But what and why? The sound of children's voices approaching pulled Margaret from her thoughts. The afternoon session began with arithmetic, and Margaret threw herself into teaching with determined focus, trying to ignore the dress, ignore Abigail's constant staring, ignore the growing unease that had settled in her stomach like a stone. As the sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, Margaret dismissed the students. They filed out in the same orderly silence they'd maintained all day, until only Abigail remained. The little girl sat at her bench, hands folded, still staring at the wedding dress. "Abigail," Margaret said gently, "it's time to go home. Your family will be worried." The child didn't move, didn't acknowledge that she'd heard. Margaret approached slowly and knelt beside the bench. "Abigail, I know you're sad about your mother. I lost my own mother when I was young. The pain doesn't go away, but it does change. It becomes something you can carry." For the first time all day, Abigail looked directly at Margaret. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a whisper so soft Margaret had to strain to hear it. "She comes at night, when the moon is dark. She walks from bench to bench, looking for something, or someone. She's wearing that dress, miss. And she's still 7 years old, just like me. Just like she was when they married her off." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "Who comes, Abigail?" "Who are you talking about?" But Abigail had already slipped off the bench and was walking toward the door with that peculiar, silent grace that seemed characteristic of all the children in this village. At the threshold she paused and looked back. "Don't be here after dark, miss. Especially not when the moon is gone. She gets angry when there's no light. She thinks the darkness belongs to her now." Then the child was gone, swallowed by the mist that had grown thicker as the day waned. Margaret stood alone in the schoolhouse, the fire in the stove burning down to embers, shadows lengthening across the rough wooden floor. Above her, the wedding dress hung motionless, and for just a moment in the fading light, Margaret could have sworn she saw it move. Just a slight twitch, as if invisible hands had brushed against it from the inside. She grabbed her satchel and fled the schoolhouse, not bothering to lock the door behind her, walking so fast through the village that she was nearly running by the time she reached her cottage. That night, Margaret lit every candle she possessed and sat by the fire, trying to make sense of what she'd learned. Her child bride, named Eliza Wren in 1819, protection symbols woven into the lace of a wedding dress. A dress that had hung in the schoolhouse for decades before the village even existed under its current name. A cold spot that defied natural explanation. And a 7-year-old girl who claimed that someone wearing the dress walked through the schoolhouse at night. Margaret told herself it was all nonsense, the product of isolation and superstition. But deep down, in a place beyond reason, she knew that Abigail Thorne had been telling the truth. And she knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that she would not be able to resist investigating further. The dress held a secret, a terrible secret, and Margaret Ashford, for all her education and rationality, was about to discover that some secrets are kept hidden for very good reasons. Outside her window, the wind continued its mournful howling, and somewhere in the darkness a child was singing again. The same pure, clear voice Margaret had heard the night before. But now she could make out the words. "Here comes the bride, all dressed in white. Here comes the bride to her wedding night. Here comes the bride with trembling hands. Here comes the bride to forsaken lands." The singing went on and on until Margaret buried her head under her pillow and prayed for dawn to come quickly. But dawn was still hours away. And in the darkness, the wedding dress hung in the empty schoolhouse, waiting patiently as it had waited for 21 years. Waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to finally ask the right questions. And now, finally, that person had arrived. Margaret slept poorly that night, her dreams filled with images of small hands reaching out from shadows and the rustle of silk in empty rooms. When she finally rose at dawn, exhausted and hollow-eyed, she found that the mist had lifted slightly, revealing the village of Stillwater Hollow in the cold morning light. It was a grim place, she realized now. The houses were built too close together, as if the inhabitants sought safety in proximity. The streets were empty of the usual morning bustle she'd known in Charleston. No vendors calling their wares, no dogs barking, no children playing. Just silence, broken only by the occasional creak of a shutter or the distant sound of someone splitting wood. Sarah Brennan appeared at Margaret's door shortly after sunrise, carrying a tray with porridge and bitter coffee. The girl's face was drawn, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she too had spent a sleepless night. She set the tray down without her usual efficiency, her hands trembling slightly. "You heard it last night, didn't you?" Sarah said without preamble. "The singing." Margaret considered denying it, maintaining her stance as a rational, educated woman who didn't believe in ghosts or curses. But something in Sarah's expression, a desperate need for honesty, made her abandon that pretense. "Yes, I heard singing. A child's voice." Sarah sank into the chair by the fireplace, a liberty she'd never taken before. The breach of social protocol spoke volumes about her state of mind. "It's gotten worse over the years. My grandmother said it used to happen only once or twice a year, on specific dates. But now it's almost every night when the moon wanes. And the singing isn't the worst part, Miss Ashford. The worst part is when it stops." Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, cradling the cup of coffee in both hands, letting its warmth seep into her fingers. "Sarah, I need you to tell me everything you know about that dress. About Eliza Wren. I can't teach in that schoolhouse. I can't live in this village without understanding what's happening." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the cold fireplace. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat, reciting facts she'd clearly been taught to keep hidden. "The dress appeared in 1819, the same year embroidered on the collar. But here's what makes no sense. Stillwater Hollow wasn't founded until 1825. Before that, this was just empty mountain land, too remote and rocky for farming. The first settlers who came here found the schoolhouse already built, already standing exactly where it is now. And the dress was already hanging inside." Margaret felt the coffee turn sour in her stomach. "That's impossible. Buildings don't just appear. Someone built that schoolhouse." Sarah met her gaze directly. "The original settlers thought maybe it had been built by hunters or trappers, some temporary shelter that got abandoned. But the construction was too fine, too permanent. And the dress, Miss Ashford, that dress was pristine, not weathered or damaged by years of abandonment. It looked like it had been hung there the day before, even though the building itself showed signs of age. My grandfather was one of those first settlers. He wanted to burn the whole place down, start fresh. But the night he made that decision, his youngest daughter fell ill with a fever that should have killed her. She recovered only after he promised out loud in that very schoolhouse that he'd never harm the building or touch the dress." Margaret set down her coffee cup, her hands no longer steady enough to hold it. "So the village was built around the schoolhouse, around the dress?" Sarah nodded. "The settlers needed a school. Their children needed education. And the building was already there, solid and dry. So they used it, but they made rules. Never touch the dress. Never take it down. Never speak its story after sunset. And most importantly, never dig beneath the floorboards under the spot where it hangs." The last rule sent a chill through Margaret's entire body. "Why? What's under the floorboards?" Sarah stood abruptly, as if she'd already said too much. "I have to go. My father will be looking for me. But Miss Ashford, if you value your life and your sanity, you'll follow those rules. Every teacher who's broken them has suffered for it. Mr. Holloway wasn't the first. And unless you're careful, you won't be the last." After Sarah left, Margaret sat in the cottage for another hour, trying to organize her thoughts. She was a teacher, a woman of education and reason. Everything Sarah had told her could be explained by coincidence and superstition. The schoolhouse had probably been built by someone who'd left no records, perhaps a hermit or an eccentric who died alone. The dress could have been stored in a trunk, preserved by the dry mountain air. The singing could be wind through cracks in the buildings, the imagination of tired minds in an isolated place. But even as Margaret constructed these rational explanations, she knew they were inadequate. She'd felt the cold beneath the dress. She'd seen the protection symbols in the lace. She'd heard the singing with her own ears. And most damning of all, she'd seen the expression in Abigail Thorne's eyes when the child had warned her about the darkness. Margaret arrived at the schoolhouse an hour before the students were due, determined to conduct a thorough investigation in the daylight. She brought a candle, matches, and a small knife she'd borrowed from the cottage kitchen. If there was something under those floorboards, she needed to know what it was. But as she approached the door, she found it already open, hanging at an odd angle as if it had been forced. Inside, the schoolhouse was in disarray. The benches had been shoved aside, arranged in a circle around the cold spot beneath the wedding dress. The slate board had been covered with words written in what looked like chalk, but when Margaret approached, she realized it was ash, still warm to the touch. The words were in a language she didn't recognize, symbols and characters that hurt her eyes to look at directly. And in the center of the circle of benches, someone had pried up 3 floorboards, revealing a darkness beneath that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. Margaret's first instinct was to run, to fetch the minister or the village council, to let someone with authority handle this violation. But curiosity, that dangerous quality that had driven her to seek education when other women sought only marriage, compelled her forward. She lit her candle and knelt at the edge of the hole, holding the flame over the darkness. The light penetrated only a few inches before being swallowed completely. It was as if the space beneath the schoolhouse existed in permanent night, untouchable by any illumination. Margaret lowered the candle further, leaning over the edge. And that's when she saw them. Bones, small bones arranged in a specific pattern. A child's skeleton, laid out with ritualistic precision. The skull was positioned at what would have been true north, the hands crossed over the chest, the legs straight. But it was what surrounded the skeleton that made Margaret drop the candle in horror. Dolls, dozens of them. Grew dolls made of corn husks and twine, each one dressed in scraps of fabric that might have once been white. Each doll had been positioned as if attending a ceremony, forming a circle around the child's remains. And each doll's face, painted with berry juice or blood, bore an expression of such anguish that Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. This was a grave. But not just a grave. A prison, a keeping place. Someone had buried a child under this schoolhouse and surrounded her with these grotesque guardians. The protection symbols on the wedding dress suddenly made terrible sense. They weren't meant to protect the dress. They were meant to keep something in. Margaret scrambled backward, her breath coming in short gasps. She needed to replace the floorboards, needed to undo whatever damage had been done by exposing the grave. But as she reached for the boards, she heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy footsteps, adult footsteps. A man entered the schoolhouse, and Margaret recognized him as John Brennan, Sarah's father and the village minister. He was a tall man, gaunt and severe, with eyes that burned with an intensity that bordered on fanaticism. Behind him came 3 other men, village elders Margaret had briefly met upon her arrival. Their expressions were grim. "So you've seen it," Brennan said flatly. "Sarah said you'd been asking questions. I'd hoped you'd have the sense to leave well enough alone. But I see we've hired another curious fool." Margaret stood, brushing dirt from her skirt, trying to summon some dignity. "There's a child buried under this schoolhouse. A child whose death was clearly not natural. This is a matter for the authorities, for the law." One of the elders, a squat man with a face like carved stone, laughed bitterly. "The law? Girl, the nearest law is 3 days' ride through mountain passes that are near impassable half the year. And even if you could reach them, what would you tell them? That we built our village on top of a grave? That there's a ghost that sings at night? They'd think you mad." Brennan held up a hand, silencing the elder. "Miss Ashford, what you've discovered is the dark heart of Stillwater Hollow. Yes, there's a child buried here. Her name was Eliza Wren, though that wasn't the name she was born with. And yes, she died here, in this very spot in 1819, but her death wasn't murder in any legal sense. It was sacrifice. The word hung in the air like a curse." Margaret felt her legs weaken, and she leaned against one of the displaced benches for support. "Sacrifice? What are you saying?" Brennan moved to the hole in the floor and looked down at the tiny skeleton with an expression that might have been regret or might have been satisfaction. The people who built this schoolhouse, they weren't settlers or trappers. They were members of a sect, a religious group that had fled persecution in Europe. They believed in the old ways, in blood offerings and dark compacts. They came to these mountains seeking isolation, a place where they could practice their faith without interference. Another elder took up the story. They made a bargain with something old, something that lived in these mountains long before any white man set foot here. They promised it a bride pure and untouched, a child bride. In exchange, the thing would grant them prosperity, protection from disease, bountiful harvests even in this rocky soil. Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. "You're telling me they murdered a child in some pagan ritual?" Brennan shook his head. "They married her first, made her a legal wife under their laws, such as they were. Her groom was no man, Miss Ashford. Her groom was the thing in the mountain. They dressed her in that white silk dress, covered it with every protection symbol they knew, hoping it would save her soul, even as they offered her body. Then they brought her here, to this schoolhouse they'd built as a temple, and they performed the ceremony. And when it was done, when the vows were spoken and the rings exchanged, the thing came to claim its bride." Margaret wanted to scream, to rage at the horror of what she was hearing. But a cold, analytical part of her mind was processing the information, fitting pieces together. The dress was meant to protect her soul, but it failed. Brennan's expression darkened. Oh, it succeeded. That's the problem. Her soul was protected, trapped, bound to this place and to that dress. She didn't pass on to whatever afterlife awaited her. She remained here, eternally 7 years old, eternally waiting for her wedding night to end. The sect realized their mistake too late. They'd created something worse than death. So they buried her body under the floorboards, surrounded her with guardian dolls made by every woman in their community. And they hung the dress from the rafters as a constant reminder of their sin. One of the elders spoke up, his voice trembling. Then they left, abandoned this place, scattered to other settlements, taking their guilt with them. But the schoolhouse remained, and the bride remained. And when the first real settlers came in 1825, they found this building and decided to use it. They didn't know what they were inheriting. By the time they understood, it was too late. Families had put down roots, children had been born, and the bride, she'd grown attached to the village. She wouldn't let them leave. Margaret's mind reeled. The fevers, the children who died, Sarah's cousin who fell in the well. Those weren't accidents, were they? Brennan's face was stone. The bride is jealous. She was forced into a marriage she didn't understand, taken from her family, made to serve a purpose beyond her comprehension. Now she watches the children of the village, the children who have families and futures. And sometimes, when her loneliness becomes too great, she takes one. Not to harm them, she believes, but to keep them company, to have playmates in her darkness. The enormity of it settled over Margaret like a shroud. This entire village was built on a foundation of horror, sustained by appeasing the ghost of a murdered child. Why tell me this now? Why not let me remain ignorant? Brennan pointed at the displaced floorboards. Because someone in this village is trying to free her. 3 times in the past month, we've found the schoolhouse disturbed like this. Someone is attempting to break the seals, to remove the protection symbols, to let her out fully. If they succeed, the bride won't be confined to this building anymore. She'll walk freely. And her hunger, her loneliness will consume every child in Stillwater Hollow. Margaret looked at the circle of benches, at the words written in ash on the slate board. Who would want to free her? The elders exchanged glances, and Margaret saw genuine fear in their eyes. We don't know, but whoever it is, they know the old rituals, the old words. They're undoing the bindings methodically, piece by piece. We've tried watching the schoolhouse at night, but the bride won't allow it. Anyone who stays after dark either flees in terror or is found the next morning mad and babbling. You're the teacher now, Miss Ashford. The schoolhouse is your domain during daylight. You must help us discover who's doing this before it's too late. Margaret wanted to refuse, wanted to pack her trunk and flee back to Charleston, to civilization and sanity. But she thought of Abigail Thorne, of all the children in the village who studied in this cursed place, innocent and unknowing. She thought of Eliza Wren, 7 years old forever, trapped between life and death by the cruelty of adults. "I'll help," Margaret heard herself say, "but on one condition. If we stop whoever is doing this, if we keep the bride contained, then we must find a way to free her properly, to lay her to rest with dignity and peace. No child deserves this fate, no matter what horrors her death has spawned." Brennan studied her for a long moment. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Ashford. But yes, if we can stop this desecration, I give you my word, we'll seek a proper solution. There are churches in the East, priests who specialize in such matters. We'll find a way." The men helped Margaret replace the floorboards, though she noticed they were careful not to look too closely into the hole, as if even a glance at those small bones might invite calamity. When the boards were back in place, they rearranged the benches and washed the ash from the slate board, though the symbols seemed to resist erasure, leaving faint marks that Margaret knew would haunt her vision. By the time the students arrived, the schoolhouse looked almost normal. Almost, but Margaret could feel the change. She'd seen what lay beneath her feet now. She knew the truth of the wedding dress that hung above her. And as she called the children to order and began the day's lessons, she found herself watching them with new eyes. One of their parents, or perhaps one of them, was trying to unleash something terrible. Someone in Stillwater Hollow wanted the bride to walk free. Margaret observed each child throughout the morning, looking for signs of guilt or knowledge. But they were remarkably ordinary in their behavior. The older boys were restless and distracted. The girls whispered among themselves during breaks. The younger children struggled with their letters and numbers. Only Abigail Thorne seemed different, her gaze still fixed on the wedding dress with that unsettling intensity. During the midday break, Margaret approached the girl as she sat alone under a bare oak tree, picking at a piece of bread. "Abigail, may I sit with you?" The child looked up, surprised. Adults didn't usually seek her company. She nodded slowly. Margaret settled onto the cold ground, arranging her skirts around her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Margaret said quietly, "You know about Eliza Wren, don't you? About the bride?" Abigail's small hands stilled. She set down her bread and turned to look at Margaret with those ancient, knowing eyes. "Everyone knows, miss. We don't talk about it because the adults tell us not to. But we all know. We feel her sometimes, especially on dark nights. She's sad, miss. So very sad." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "Do you know who might be trying to help her? Who's been disturbing the schoolhouse at night?" For the first time since Margaret had met her, Abigail smiled. It was a sad smile, full of a compassion that no 7-year-old should possess. "Someone who loves her, miss. Someone who can't bear to see her suffer anymore. Someone who thinks death would be kinder than eternal waiting." Before Margaret could press further, the other children began filing back into the schoolhouse. Abigail stood, brushed crumbs from her dress, and followed them. But at the door she paused and looked back. "Be careful, Miss Ashford. Love and mercy can look very much like cruelty when you don't understand the whole story." The afternoon passed in a blur of lessons and growing anxiety. Margaret's mind churned with possibilities. Who in the village would have both the knowledge of the old rituals and the motivation to free the bride? It would have to be someone who'd lived here long enough to know the truth, someone with access to the schoolhouse, someone driven by either compassion or madness. As the sun began its descent, Margaret dismissed the students and prepared to lock up. But Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale and frightened. "Miss Ashford, my father wants you to stay tonight, to watch and see if whoever's doing this returns. He and the elders will be nearby, hidden but close enough to help if needed. Will you do it?" Every instinct screamed at Margaret to refuse. But she thought of those small bones under the floorboards, of Eliza Wren, trapped in eternal childhood, and she nodded. "I'll stay, but I want a weapon. A pistol, if you have one." Sarah handed her a small revolver already loaded. "My father said you'd ask. He said to tell you, if you see her, don't try to shoot. Bullets can't harm the dead, but if you see a living person, someone trying to break the seals, you must stop them at any cost." As darkness fell, Margaret sat at the teacher's desk, the revolver in her lap, and waited. She'd built up the fire in the stove, but its warmth didn't reach the cold spot beneath the wedding dress. That pocket of winter air remained constant, a reminder of the unnatural presence that haunted this place. Hours passed. The fire burned down to embers. The moon, already waning, provided barely enough light through the windows, too. And then, just past midnight, Margaret heard it, the singing. But this time it wasn't outside. It was inside the schoolhouse, coming from directly above her. From the wedding dress. Margaret forced herself to look up, her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might crack. The dress was swaying gently as if caught in a breeze. But there was no breeze. The air in the schoolhouse was perfectly still. And then Margaret saw her, a little girl, translucent and glowing, with a faint, sickly light, materialized beside the dress. She was wearing an identical dress, though this one was somehow more solid, more real. Her hair was long and blonde, her face delicate and beautiful. But her eyes were empty voids that seemed to contain all the darkness of the grave. Eliza Wren, the bride, turned her head slowly and looked directly at Margaret. The singing stopped. In the terrible silence that followed, Margaret heard her own breathing, ragged and panicked. Then the bride spoke, her voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Teacher, new teacher, are you the one? Are you here to set me free?" Margaret's hand tightened on the revolver, though she knew it was useless. "No, child. I'm here to protect you, to keep you safe, until we can find a proper way to release you." The bride's expression didn't change, but something shifted in those empty eyes. Disappointment, relief? They all say that. All the teachers. They promise to help, to find a way. But they never do. They run away, or they die, or they forget. And I remain. Always I remain, waiting for a wedding night that will never end, married to darkness and loneliness. Margaret stood slowly, setting the revolver on the desk. Against all reason, against all fear, she felt a wave of compassion for this trapped spirit. "I won't forget, Eliza, I promise you. But you must tell me, who is trying to free you? Who's been breaking the seals?" The bride turned away, her translucent form drifting toward the windows. Someone who understands. Someone who knows that living forever is worse than dying. Someone who loves me enough to risk everything. Before Margaret could ask more, she heard a sound outside. Footsteps, soft and careful, approaching the schoolhouse door. The bride vanished instantly, winking out of existence like a snuffed candle. Margaret grabbed the revolver and positioned herself behind the desk, her eyes fixed on the door. The latch lifted slowly and the door creaked open. A figure entered, small and hunched, carrying a cloth bag that clinked with the sound of metal tools. Margaret waited until the figure moved into the center of the room, heading directly for the floorboards beneath the wedding dress. Then she cocked the revolver, the click impossibly loud in the silence. "Stop right there! Don't move." The figure froze, then slowly turned, and Margaret's blood turned to ice. It was old Betsy, the ancient woman who'd spoken to her on her first day. The woman who'd warned her about the cold spot beneath the dress. "You," Margaret whispered. "Why?" Old Betsy set down her bag with a sigh. Her face in the dim moonlight looked older than time itself, etched with lines of sorrow so deep they seemed carved into her very bones. "Because I owe her. Because I'm the reason she's here." Margaret kept the gun trained on the old woman, but her mind was racing. "I don't understand." Old Betsy moved slowly to one of the benches and sat down heavily. "My name wasn't always Betsy Marsh. I was born Elizabeth Brennan in 1812. John Brennan, your minister. He's my great-great-nephew. And Eliza Wren, the bride, she was my sister." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. "Your sister? But that would make you 88 years old," Betsy finished. "Yes, I'm far older than anyone in this village knows. I've lived long past my natural span, and you know why? Because she's kept me alive. My sister, trapped in that dress, has held me here with her. She won't let me die because I'm the last person who remembers her as she truly was." Before the sect, before the marriage, before everything went so terribly wrong, Margaret slowly lowered the gun, though she didn't put it down. Tell me everything." And in the darkness of the schoolhouse, with the wedding dress hanging above them like a captured ghost, old Betsy began to speak. "We weren't born in these mountains. We came from a village in Pennsylvania, good Presbyterian folk. But our parents fell into debt, terrible debt. A man came to our town, a preacher from a sect no one had heard of. He offered to pay our parents' debts in full, to save our farm, our home. All he asked in return was one child, a daughter, for a special ceremony, he said, a holy marriage that would bless the whole community." Betsy's voice cracked. "My parents, God forgive them, they were desperate. They had 3 daughters. I was the oldest at 15, my middle sister was 12, and Eliza, our baby, was only 7. The preacher looked at all of us and chose Eliza, said she was pure, untouched by the world's corruption, said she'd be honored, exalted. We didn't understand what he meant." Margaret felt tears burning in her eyes as she listened. "Your parents let him take her?" Betsy nodded, her own tears flowing freely now. "They thought it was just a ceremony, a ritual marriage that wouldn't be consummated. They thought she'd be returned to us after serving some symbolic purpose. But I knew. I don't know how, but I knew. I begged them not to let her go. I fought so hard my father had to lock me in the cellar. And while I was locked away, screaming myself hoarse, the preacher took my baby sister away to these mountains. By the time I got free and followed, weeks had passed. I tracked them here to this very spot. But I was too late." The old woman's whole body shook with sobs. The schoolhouse was newly built. The sect was preparing to leave, their bargain complete. And Eliza was already in the ground wearing that cursed dress. They told me she'd died blessed and holy, that her soul was preserved in heaven. But I knew the truth when I saw that dress hanging there. They'd trapped her. My baby sister, who was afraid of the dark, who loved picking wildflowers, who sang all the time, they'd trapped her in eternal darkness. Margaret's hands trembled as she finally set the revolver down on the bench beside her. The weight of Betsy's confession hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Outside, an owl hooted, the sound eerily human in its mournfulness. "You've been trying to free her," Margaret said softly. "All these years, you've been trying to break the seals and release her soul." Betsy wiped her eyes with the corner of her shawl, her ancient hands shaking. "Not all these years. For decades, I was too frightened, too bound by the promises I'd made to the elders who took me in after the sect disappeared. They made me swear never to disturb the grave, never to speak of what happened. They said if I tried to free her, she might become something worse, something that would destroy the entire village. So I stayed silent. I married, had children, watched them grow old and die while I lingered on, kept alive by my sister's unnatural binding to this place. But 3 months ago, something changed." Margaret leaned forward, her exhaustion forgotten. "What changed?" Betsy stood and moved to the window, staring out into the darkness. "I had a dream. The first real dream I'd had in 70 years. Usually my sleep is empty, as if even my subconscious is held prisoner by this curse. But in this dream, Eliza came to me. She looked exactly as she did the last time I saw her, wearing her everyday dress, her hair in braids. She took my hand and said, 'Betsy, I'm so tired. I've been waiting so long. Please, sister, let me rest. Let me go where children are supposed to go when they die.' When I woke, I knew I had to try. Even if it meant damning myself, even if it meant risking the village, I had to give my sister peace." Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. "The minister said that if you succeed, if you break all the seals, she'll be free to roam beyond this schoolhouse. That she'll take the village's children out of loneliness and jealousy." Betsy turned back to face her, and in the moonlight filtering through the windows, Margaret saw something fierce and determined in the old woman's expression. "John Brennan is my blood, but he's also a coward and a fool. Yes, if the seals are broken improperly, without the right rituals, Eliza's spirit could become dangerous. But there's another way, a way to release her completely, to send her on to whatever lies beyond. The sect that bound her here, they had texts, books of rituals and ceremonies. Before they scattered, they hid those books somewhere in these mountains. I've spent the last 3 months searching for them, and 2 weeks ago I found them." She reached into her cloth bag and pulled out a leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The cover was marked with the same protection symbols that adorned the wedding dress. This book contains the binding ritual they used. But more importantly, it contains the unbinding ritual, the way to properly release a trapped soul. It requires 3 things: the willing participation of a blood relative, a new teacher who has seen the bride and lived, and a sacrifice. Margaret's blood ran cold. "What kind of sacrifice?" Betsy's smile was sad and knowing. "Not a life, if that's what you're thinking. The sacrifices of memory. Whoever performs the unbinding must give up all memory of the trapped soul. Every moment shared, every word spoken, every feeling felt. It all must be surrendered completely. The dead can only move on when the living truly let them go." The implications settled over Margaret like a heavy blanket. You would forget your sister entirely. 70 years of holding on to her memory, and you'd lose it all. Betsy nodded slowly. "I would forget I ever had a sister named Eliza. I would forget why I've lived so long, why I've suffered so much. In a way, I would lose myself, because she's been the center of my existence for more than a lifetime. But she would be free, finally blessedly free, and that's worth any price." Margaret stood and moved to stand beside the old woman at the window. Together, they looked out at the sleeping village, at the houses huddled in the darkness. "When do you want to do this? When do you want to perform the unbinding?" Betsy consulted the book, running her finger down a page of cramped handwriting. "The ritual can only be performed on a night when the moon is completely dark, when the barriers between worlds are thinnest. The new moon is in 3 days. That's when we must act." Margaret's mind raced. "The minister and the elders, they're watching the schoolhouse. They'll try to stop us." Betsy closed the book carefully. "Then we must be clever. We must make them believe we've given up, that the attempts to break the seals have stopped. For the next 3 days, nothing must happen here. No disturbances, no violations. Let them think whoever was doing this has been frightened away. Then on the night of the new moon, when their vigilance has relaxed, we act. It was a dangerous plan, one that could fail in a dozen different ways." But as Margaret looked up at the wedding dress, hanging in the shadows above them, as she thought of Eliza Wren, condemned to eternal childhood, she knew there was no other choice. "I'll help you, but you have to promise me something." Betsy met her gaze. "What?" "If this works, if we free her and you forget, someone needs to know the truth. Someone needs to remember what really happened here, what this village is built on. Let me write it down. Let me record the whole story, so that someday, when enough time has passed, the truth can be told." Betsy considered this for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, the truth should be recorded. Too many lies have been told already, too many sins hidden beneath layers of secrecy. Write it down, Miss Ashford." "Write it all down. But hide it well, because if the village council discovers what we're planning, they'll stop us by any means necessary. They've built their lives on this horror, and they won't let it go easily." The 2 women stood in the darkness for a moment longer. An unlikely alliance formed in the shadow of a child's eternal suffering. Then Betsy gathered her bag and the ancient book. "I should go before the elders realize I'm here. They think I'm senile, that I barely leave my cottage. That belief has served me well. Let them continue thinking it." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Miss Ashford, thank you. Thank you for not shooting me, for listening, for being willing to help. Most people would have run screaming. Most people would have chosen their own safety over a dead child's peace." Margaret managed a weak smile. "I'm not most people. And I made a promise to Eliza. I intend to keep it." After Betsy left, Margaret remained in the schoolhouse for another hour, building up the fire, trying to process everything she'd learned. The bride didn't appear again, but Margaret could feel her presence, a watchful awareness that permeated the very walls of the building. Finally, exhausted beyond measure, Margaret locked up and made her way back to her cottage through the pre-dawn darkness. The village was still asleep, windows dark, streets empty. Only the wind moved through the narrow lanes, carrying with it the scent of coming winter and something else, something that might have been decay or might have been roses. Margaret couldn't tell which. The next 3 days passed in a strange tension. Margaret taught her classes as usual, maintained a facade of normalcy, while beneath the surface she and Betsy prepared for the unbinding ritual. They met secretly, always careful to ensure no one saw them together. Betsy shared the details of the ritual, walking Margaret through each step, each word that would need to be spoken. It was complex and demanding, requiring precise timing and unwavering focus. One mistake could bind Eliza even more tightly, or worse, could release her in a corrupted form that would indeed bring calamity to the village. Margaret spent her evenings transcribing everything into a journal, creating a detailed account of the village's dark history, of Eliza's fate, of the sect's crimes. She wrote in tiny, cramped letters, filling page after page, determined that if she failed, if something went wrong during the ritual, at least the truth would survive. She hid the journal in a hollow space she discovered behind a loose board in her cottage wall, wrapping it in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and time. During the day, she watched the children in her classroom with new understanding. These were innocents, unaware of the horror that had shaped their village, of the price that had been paid for their community's existence. Abigail Thorne continued her silent vigil, staring at the wedding dress with those knowing eyes. But on the second day, the child did something unexpected. During the midday break, while the other students played outside, Abigail approached Margaret's desk and placed a small object on it. A doll. A corn-husk doll dressed in white fabric, its face painted with berry juice in an expression of peace. "For after," Abigail whispered, "when it's done. So she won't be alone on her journey." Margaret stared at the child, her breath catching. You know what we're planning." Abigail nodded solemnly. "She told me. In my dreams. She said you and the old woman are going to help her. She wanted me to thank you. She said I remind her of someone she loved a long time ago." Tears sprang to Margaret's eyes. "You remind her of her sister, of Betsy, when Betsy was young." The little girl smiled, a genuine smile full of childhood innocence that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "I hope it works, Miss Ashford. I hope she gets to be free. No one should have to be alone forever." On the evening of the third day, as the sun set and the new moon prepared to rise, invisible in its darkness, Margaret made her final preparations. She told the minister and elders that she'd seen nothing suspicious for the past 3 nights, that perhaps whoever had been disturbing the schoolhouse had given up. They'd been relieved, praising her diligence, and their watch on the building had grown noticeably more lax. Tonight, only one elder would be keeping watch from his home across the square, and Margaret knew from Betsy that the man was nearly deaf and slept poorly. They would have their opportunity. As darkness fell complete and total, with no moon to light the sky, Margaret slipped out of her cottage. She carried nothing but a single candle and the corn-husk doll Abigail had given her. The village was silent, every window dark. Even the usual night sounds seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding its breath. She made her way to the schoolhouse, her heart pounding so hard she was certain someone would hear it. But the streets remained empty, and soon she was pushing open the schoolhouse door and stepping into the familiar darkness within. Betsy was already there, sitting on one of the benches, the ancient book open on her lap. The old woman had lit several candles, arranging them in a specific pattern on the floor beneath the wedding dress. The cold spot seemed more pronounced tonight, a well of frigid air that made Margaret's breath visible even before she stepped into it. "You came," Betsy said softly. "I wasn't certain you would. The reality of what we're about to do, the risk, I thought perhaps you might reconsider." Margaret shook her head and moved to join the old woman in the circle of candlelight. "I gave my word, and more than that, this is right. What was done to Eliza was an abomination. Keeping her trapped here for 70 years compounds that sin. Tonight we end it." Betsy nodded and stood, her ancient bones creaking with the effort. She handed Margaret a page from the book, covered with phonetic transcriptions of words in a language Margaret didn't recognize. You'll need to read these lines when I indicate. Pronunciation is critical. Practice them now while we wait for the hour to turn. Margaret studied the words, whispering them under her breath, trying to capture the strange cadence and rhythm. They felt wrong in her mouth, these words, as if language itself was resisting their utterance. But she persisted, repeating them over and over until they began to feel almost natural. At precisely midnight, Betsy rose and moved to the center of the cold spot, directly beneath the wedding dress. She spread her arms wide and began to speak in that same strange language, her voice surprisingly strong and clear. The candles flickered violently despite the absence of any breeze. The temperature in the schoolhouse dropped precipitously, and frost began forming on the windows in intricate patterns. Margaret watched in awe and terror as the air itself seemed to thicken, becoming almost solid, pressing against her skin like cold mud. And then Eliza appeared. But this time, she was different. More solid, more present. She materialized, standing directly in front of Betsy, looking up at the old woman with an expression of such hope and longing that Margaret felt her heart break. "Betsy," the bride whispered, "is it really you? You look so different, so old." Betsy's face crumpled, decades of grief and regret visible in every line. "Yes, little one, it's me. I'm sorry I couldn't save you before. I'm sorry it took me so long to find the courage to do this. But tonight, I promise you, tonight you'll finally be free." Eliza reached out a translucent hand, not quite touching her sister's wrinkled cheek. "Will it hurt, the unbinding? Will I remember you, where I'm going?" Betsy's voice broke. "I don't know what you'll remember, sweet girl, but I hope you remember being loved. I hope you remember that you were cherished, that you were precious, that your life, short as it was, mattered." Tears streamed down the old woman's face. "Now we have to begin. The hour is right, the moon is dark. It's time." She nodded to Margaret, who stepped forward and began reading from the page, stumbling over the alien words but pushing through. As she spoke, the candle flames turned blue, then green, then a color Margaret had no name for. The wedding dress began to glow with its own light, the protection symbols woven into its lace burning like small stars. Betsy continued her part of the ritual, speaking words that seemed to twist reality itself. The floorboards beneath her feet began to crack, the sound like breaking bones. And from those cracks, a light emerged, warm and golden, completely unlike the sickly luminescence that usually accompanied the bride's appearances. Eliza gasped, turning toward the light with an expression of wonder. "What is that? What's happening?" Betsy's voice was steady now, filled with a calm certainty. "That's the way forward, Eliza. That's the path you should have walked 70 years ago. The path those evil men stole from you. But it's open now. You can take it. You can leave this place, leave the pain and loneliness, and go where children are meant to go when their time in this world is done." The bride turned back to her sister, conflict visible in her ghostly features. "But if I go, I'll be alone again. Here at least I have you. I have the children who come to learn. I have—" Betsy interrupted gently. "You have nothing here but pain, child. You deserve peace. You deserve rest. And you won't be alone. I promise you that. On the other side of that light there are people waiting for you. People who love you. Our mother, who wept herself to death a year after you were taken. Our father, who drank himself into an early grave from guilt. They're waiting, Eliza. They want to hold you again, to tell you they're sorry, to make right what they made so wrong." Hope and fear warred in the bride's expression. She looked at the golden light, then back at Betsy, then at Margaret. "And you, teacher, what will happen to you?" Margaret stepped forward, kneeling so she was at eye level with the small ghost. "I'll be fine. I'll teach other children. I'll tell your story, so people remember what happened here, so it never happens again. You've suffered enough, Eliza. It's time to stop suffering." The bride considered this, her translucent form flickering like a candle flame. Then she nodded slowly. "Will you do something for me, teacher? Will you take my dress down? It's been my prison for so long. I don't want it to stay here after I'm gone. I want it burned, destroyed, so no one else can ever use it for such evil purposes." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her own face now. "I will, I promise." Eliza turned to Betsy one last time. "I love you, sister. Thank you for remembering me. Thank you for not giving up." Betsy reached out as if to embrace the child, but her arms passed through the ghostly form. "I love you too, little one. More than life itself. Now go. Go and be at peace." The bride turned toward the golden light and took a step forward. As she did, she began to change. The white silk dress dissolved, replaced by the simple everyday clothes Margaret had seen in Betsy's description. Her hair came loose from its wedding style, falling in natural curls around her shoulders. She looked less like a bride and more like what she truly was, a little girl going home. With each step toward the light, she became more solid, more real, until she looked almost alive. At the threshold of the light, she paused and looked back one last time. She was smiling. A genuine, joyful child's smile. "Thank you," she whispered. And then she stepped through, and the golden light swallowed her completely. The moment Eliza vanished, the ritual reached its climax. Betsy cried out, a sound of pure anguish, and collapsed to her knees. The wedding dress hanging above them began to disintegrate, the silk turning to ash, the lace crumbling, until nothing remained but a faint shower of dust that settled on the floorboards like snow. The cold spot vanished instantly, the temperature in the schoolhouse rising to normal. The candles returned to their usual color, and the golden light faded, leaving only ordinary darkness behind. Margaret rushed to Betsy's side, helping the old woman to her feet. Betsy was trembling, her face slack with confusion. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice quavering. "Where am I? What's happening?" Margaret's heart sank. The sacrifice had been complete. Betsy had lost all memory of her sister and apparently all memory of why she was here. "You're in the schoolhouse," Margaret said gently. "You came here tonight, but I think you got confused. Let me help you home." She guided the old woman out of the schoolhouse and through the dark streets to Betsy's cottage. The woman went docilely, like a confused child, asking questions but seeming to forget the answers as soon as Margaret gave them. Once Margaret had Betsy settled in her bed, apparently none the worse for wear physically, she returned to the schoolhouse. Dawn was still hours away, but Margaret knew she couldn't wait. She had promises to keep. She spent the next hour carefully prying up the floorboards beneath where the dress had hung. The bones were still there, small and fragile, but they seemed different now, less oppressive, less wrong. Margaret gathered them carefully, wrapping them in a clean cloth from her satchel. She also collected the corn-husk dolls, those grotesque guardians that had surrounded the grave for 70 years. As the first grey light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Margaret carried her burden to the edge of the village, to a spot where wildflowers grew even this late in the season. She dug a new grave, this one shallow and simple, and laid the bones to rest properly. Over them, she placed the corn-husk dolls in a circle, but this time arranged them facing outward, as if guarding nothing, freed from their endless vigil. She marked the spot with a simple wooden cross and whispered a prayer, though she wasn't certain what god or gods might be listening. On her way back to the village, Margaret stopped at her cottage and retrieved the journal she'd hidden behind the wall. She added one final entry, describing the ritual, the unbinding, Eliza's passage into the light. Then she wrapped it again and returned it to its hiding place. Someday, perhaps decades from now, someone would find it. Someone would learn the truth. But for now, the story would remain hidden as the bones now resting beneath the wildflowers. When Margaret arrived at the schoolhouse for the day's lessons, she found the minister and several elders already there, staring up at the empty space where the wedding dress had hung. Their faces were studies in shock and confusion. "Miss Ashford," Brennan said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Where is it? Where's the dress?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I removed it last night. It disintegrated when I touched it, crumbled to dust. Whatever power it held is gone now. The bride is gone. She won't haunt this place anymore." She waited for anger, for accusations, for threats. But instead, the minister's face crumpled. To her surprise, he looked relieved. "Is it true?" Is she really gone? Margaret nodded. She's at peace now. Finally, after 70 years, she's at rest. One of the elders, the squat man with the carved stone face, shook his head. This is a disaster. Without the bride's binding to this place, without her unnatural presence, the protections she inadvertently provided will fail. The thing in the mountain, the thing she was married to, it might return. It might claim the village as its own. Margaret had considered this possibility, had lain awake worrying about it. But something in her gut told her that fear was unfounded. The thing in the mountain, if it ever existed, was bound to Eliza. It claimed its bride and received its sacrifice. The contract was fulfilled. It has no claim on this village now. She spoke with more confidence than she felt, but as the words left her mouth, she knew they were true. The morning air felt different, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from the very atmosphere. Brennan studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We'll see. We'll watch and wait. If calamity befalls us, Miss Ashford, know that it's on your head. But the threat was hollow, and they both knew it. Whatever darkness had claimed Stillwater Hollow, whatever sin had stained its foundations, was beginning to lift. The students arrived, and Margaret began the day's lessons in a schoolhouse that felt, for the first time since she'd arrived, like a normal place of learning. The children were more animated, less subdued. Even Abigail Thorne seemed lighter, her ancient eyes regaining some measure of childhood innocence. During the midday break, the girl approached Margaret's desk again. She's really gone, isn't she? Abigail whispered. I can feel it. The sadness is gone. Margaret knelt beside the child and hugged her gently. Yes, she's gone. She's where she's supposed to be now. Abigail smiled, and for the first time, Margaret saw the carefree little girl she should have been all along. Good, I'm glad. She was always so lonely. Now maybe she has friends. As the days passed into weeks and weeks into months, it became clear that the bride's departure had indeed changed Stillwater Hollow fundamentally. The village began to feel less isolated, less oppressive. Several families who'd been planning to leave decided to stay. New settlers arrived, drawn by reports of good land and a strong community. The schoolhouse was just a schoolhouse now, nothing more. The cold spot never returned, and no child ever reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. Betsy Marsh, now thoroughly elderly and confused, lived on for another 3 years before passing peacefully in her sleep. At her funeral, Margaret noticed that the old woman looked younger somehow, as if a great burden had been lifted from her, even though she couldn't remember what that burden had been. Margaret stayed in Stillwater Hollow for 5 more years, teaching generation after generation of children, watching the village transform from a place haunted by its past into a genuine community with hope for the future. But eventually, the wanderlust that had brought her to the mountains in the first place called to her again. She prepared to leave, training her replacement, packing her few belongings. On her last night in the cottage, she retrieved the journal from its hiding place behind the wall. She held it for a long time, considering what to do with it. Part of her wanted to destroy it, to let the past remain buried with Eliza's bones. But she'd made a promise. The truth deserved to be known, even if that knowing came decades or centuries hence. She placed the journal back in its hiding place, but this time she left a note with it. Written in her careful hand, to whoever finds this, read what is written here, and know that evil can be undone, that curses can be broken, that even the darkest sins can be redeemed. The child whose story is recorded here suffered terribly, but in the end, she found peace. Remember her. Remember what was done to her, and ensure that nothing like it ever happens again. Margaret left Stillwater Hollow on a bright spring morning in 1846, traveling by wagon down the mountain passes towards civilization. She never returned, but she often thought of the village, of the children she'd taught, and especially of Eliza Wren, the town's youngest bride. Years later, when she was an old woman herself, living in a boarding house in Philadelphia, Margaret received a letter. It was from Abigail Thorne, now a grown woman with children of her own. The letter was brief but meaningful. Dear Miss Ashford, I wanted you to know that Stillwater Hollow thrives. The schoolhouse you taught in stands strong, and my own daughter learns her letters there. Sometimes, on warm spring days, we take walks to the edge of the village, to a spot where wildflowers grow around an old wooden cross. We don't know who's buried there, but we leave flowers anyway. It seems like the right thing to do. The village prospers. Children grow up happy and safe. Whatever shadows haunted this place when you first arrived are long gone. Thank you for that. Thank you for being brave enough to help break a curse that had bound us for generations. With deepest gratitude, Abigail Thorne Brennan. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in her Bible between the pages of Psalms. That night, she dreamed of a little girl in a simple dress, playing in a field of wildflowers, laughing with pure joy. In the dream, the girl looked up, saw Margaret watching and waved. Then she turned and ran toward two figures in the distance, a man and woman with arms outstretched, waiting to embrace her. When Margaret woke, tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. Somewhere, somehow, Eliza Wren had found her way home. And that was worth every risk, every fear, every sleepless night in that haunted schoolhouse. The town's youngest bride had finally been released from her terrible marriage. And though her wedding dress no longer hung in the schoolhouse, her memory, preserved in a hidden journal waiting to be discovered, would endure. The truth would survive, passed down through generations, a reminder of humanity's capacity for both terrible cruelty and profound redemption. And in the end, perhaps that was the real lesson. Not that evil exists, but that it can be overcome. Not that curses are real, but that they can be broken. Not that children can be sacrificed, but that they can be saved, even decades after their deaths, by those willing to risk everything for justice and peace.